Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 19422 in the name of Gillian Martin on Natural Environment Scotland Bill at stage 1. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Cabinet Secretary Gillian Martin to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to open today's debate on the general principles of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. Presiding Officer, this Parliament has a long and proud record of championing nature, biodiversity and wildlife, and I thank the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee for their very comprehensive scrutiny of the bill, and though all of those who gave evidence at stage 1. I also want to acknowledge the stakeholders that we have met in Government during the development of the bill, whose contributions have helped shape our approach. I welcome the committee's recommendation that Parliament support the general principles of the bill. And so, while I look forward to hearing members' views on how the bill can be improved and strengthened at stage 2, I hope we can reaffirm that commitment today by supporting the general principles of this bill and recognising the urgency of the crisis that it seeks to address. Let me begin with a stark statistic, and I invite everyone to think about what this really means. Last year, PricewaterhouseCoopers estimated that over 55% of the world's GDP is dependent on nature. That's more than half the world's economic activity relies on healthy ecosystems. People often talk about how lucky we are to live in Scotland, and of course they're absolutely right. Just look at our magnificent landscapes and coastlines, our lochs, glens, our forests, our iconic species like the golden eagle, Scottish wildcat. But beneath this beauty lies a troubling truth. Biodiversity is in Scotland, both globally and at home. And across the world, we know that 1 million species face extinction in the coming decades unless we act now. And this isn't just a distant issue happening elsewhere, it's happening on our doorstep, with 1 in 9 species already threatened here in Scotland. And since 1994, monitored species have seen an average 15% drop in numbers. There's no doubt that nature is at risk, threatening lives, habitats and the balance of our natural world and the sectors, communities and our economies that rely on it. And the nature and climate emergencies are so deeply intertwined. Nature regulates our climate, and the climate impacts on nature. The natural environment brings huge benefits to us as human beings in terms of our human health and well-being. For example, cleaning our air and water, storing harmful carbon, reducing flooding. The World Economic Forum recently ranked biodiversity loss as the second highest global risk over the next decade, just behind extreme weather. And we cannot afford to treat nature as an optional extra. It's the foundation of our health, our economy and of our life support systems. Every part of our natural environment plays a role in supporting the systems that we depend on, from the tiniest microbes to apex predators. This intricate web of life underpins the industries that sustain us, providing food, clean water, energy, shelter and even medicines. Protecting and restoring nature isn't just about conservation, it's about doing what is right for the good of all of us. Scotland's natural environment is part of who we are. It sustains our communities, it defines our place in the world, makes our communities resilient. And by safeguarding it, we honour our responsibility to future generations and preserve the landscapes and the wildlife that make Scotland thrive. At the same time, we're securing foundations of our economy and well-being, including sectors like farming, fishing, forestry, that are deeply dependent on the health of our ecosystems. In Scotland, natural capital supports £40.1 billion in economic output and over 260,000 jobs, from tourism and recreation to food and drink. We know that many sectors depend directly on nature. And nature is not just an economic asset, it's a public health necessity, with access to nature improving mental and physical well-being. In deprived areas, for example, studies show that children who spend just 60 minutes a day in nature have a 50% lower risk of mental health issues. We now know just enough about biodiversity to understand that removing even small pieces of the puzzle can have unpredictable and cascading effects. Turning to the legislation before us, I want to be clear that this bill is not a standalone measure. It builds on our biodiversity strategy published last year, which sets out a long-term vision to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and restore nature by 2045. That strategy is supported by 6 yearly rolling delivery plans, including our commitment to protect 30% of Scotland's land and seas for nature by 2030. With the first suite of Nature 30 sites already announced, expanding and enhancing nature networks with local authorities and partners to deliver ecological, social and economic benefits, supporting restoration through our £65 million Nature Restoration Fund, which has funded nearly 800 projects since 2021. These are transformative actions, but we need the legislative tools to match our ambition. The Natural Environment Bill is the next critical step. It places a duty on ministers to set statutory nature restoration targets. It modernises the aims and powers of national park authorities. It reforms deer management and creates a bespoke power to update environmental impact assessments and habitats legislation, addressing a gap left by EU exit. I will.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She'll be aware that during the committee scrutiny of the bill that there was concern from stakeholders about Part 4 of the bill, where it provides more powers to Nature Scot and the potential conflict of interest between Nature Scot and the additional powers they would get under Part 4 of the bill. Does she understand that there is growing concern that Nature Scot is quite often conflicted with its roles as both an authority to look after species numbers, but also one that then gives out licences to control species numbers? And is this something we can consider as this bill develops?
Cabinet Secretary.
This bill is not really to define the role of Nature Scot. I'm happy to take on any considerations or any feedback from any member who have any specific issues around conflicts of interest. This bill is not really designed to do that, but if the member has any specific examples of what he means by conflicts of interest, he is most welcome to write to me. We will no doubt get into the detail of the committee's report and its recommendations as we debate the bill today, but there is one part in particular that I would like to address now. While generally supportive of the approach in parts 1, 3 and 4 of the bill, I recognise that there were issues raised by the committee about the extent of the delegated power taken in part 2 and the concerns raised by environmental NGOs that the power could be used to dilute environmental protection. Let me be absolutely clear. The Scottish Government is unequivocally committed to protecting our environment. This has not been designed to dilute those environmental protections. Can I just finish the point and then I'll take Sarah Boyack. Part 2 is designed to address a legislative gap left by EU exit and to complement existing but limited powers. Without this bespoke power, vital regimes like the Habitats Regulation risk becoming static and outdated. That said, I have heard the concern and I am listening. My officials and I have been engaging with stakeholders and I am committed to bringing forward Stage 2 amendments to strengthen those safeguards for the future use of this power. And I'll take Sarah Boyack.
Sarah Boyack.
It's a very useful update from the Cabinet Secretary because it is a key issue that many organisations are deeply worried about, that we could inadvertently reduce our environmental standards and impact on our nature safety. So we will look forward to seeing those amendments because we are all looking at potential amendments to address this problem.
Cabinet Secretary.
I wanted to finish that point before I took Sarah Boyack's intervention there, to make the point that I am listening and I am thinking of bringing forward my own amendments in this place. But I am also, as Sarah Boyack will know, very keen to talk to members about how they think it could be strengthened. I think the point was made that we can't rely on the current government and the current flavour of administration. We need to make sure that we, in the event of any political decisions being made by this country that have people in government who do not share our views on nature protection, that we protect nature against any future governments overturning of protection for nature. So I'm keen to hear members' views in this debate on how Part 2 can be improved. and ensure Parliament is sending a strong and united message to everyone that we are in support of the bill. Presiding Officer, the bill represents the next step in our journey to become nature positive by 2030 and to restore and regenerate biodiversity by 2045. It is ambitious, it is necessary, but it's only one part of the wider effort we must make across government, across sectors, across society. I want to deliver an effective bill. I'm listening to proposals that will strengthen it, and I'm committed to working with stakeholders and members across this chamber to ensure that it delivers the change our natural environment so urgently needs. And I move the motion that Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Could I remind those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Finlay Carson to open on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. Update minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak today on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee to set out the findings of our Stage 1 report. The committee began its scrutiny of the bill back in March when we issued a call for written evidence. We also held 12 evidence sessions between March and June, hearing from a range of stakeholders and 3 Scottish Government ministers. We went on a fact-finding visit to the Cairngorms National Park, where we held a community engagement event and visited 3 estates which take different approaches to land management. The committee also held an online engagement event with deer practitioners to discuss Part 4 of the bill. On behalf of the committee, let me take this opportunity to thank all those stakeholders, some who are in the gallery today, who supported our considerations of the bill and the hard work of the clerks and Spice. Throughout our Stage 1 scrutiny, the committee heard concerning evidence about the scale of biodiversity loss that has taken place in Scotland over recent decades. The State of Nature report has assessed that 1 in 9 species in Scotland are at risk of national extinction. We agree with the Scottish Government's intention to introduce statutory nature targets in Part 1 of the bill as a way of galvanising a national response to tackling this nature emergency. We were also clear that statutory targets are not a silver bullet to protect the natural environment, and the Scottish Government will not meet targets unless they are underpinned by meaningful action and resources that support their implementation. The committee also scrutinised the processes for setting and monitoring statutory targets and made a number of recommendations on how these frameworks could be improved. I welcome the commitment made by the Cabinet Secretary in a response to a report to give these points further consideration ahead of Stage 2. The committee was also supportive of the decision to appoint Environmental Standards Scotland to independently review the Scottish Government's progress towards delivering statutory targets. But we agreed with the ESS that its role should be clarified and strengthened as the bill progresses. We were also clear that the ESS must have the necessary powers and resources to carry out its new functions effectively. Turning to Part 2 of the bill on powers to modify EIA legislation and habitat regulations. The committee heard strong opposition to this provision from most stakeholders, with many arguing the proposed powers in Part 2 were excessively broad and lacked sufficient environmental safeguards. The committee made several recommendations about how these concerns could be addressed through strengthening environmental protections and enhanced parliamentary oversight. There remained within the committee, however, significant mixed views about whether Part 2 should be strengthened or simply removed altogether. The Cabinet Secretary indicated in response to a report that the Scottish Government intends to bring forward amendments that would tighten up Part 2 and provide greater clarity on how these powers could be exercised. And I asked the Cabinet Secretary in our summing up to set out a bit more detail about what these amendments might look like. Turning to Part 3 of the bill on the management of national parks, the committee heard general support amongst most stakeholders for the bill's proposals. There were some concerns, however, about the revised aims for national parks and that they would not go far enough in addressing some of the social and economic challenges faced by rural communities, the potential resource implications for public bodies in meeting their new requirements to facilitate the implementation of, instead of having regard to, the National Park plans and how the use of fixed penalty notices would operate alongside the park ranger's existing educational role is also vital. Finally, on Part 4 of the bill relating to deer management, much of the evidence we received related to proposals to introduce new enforcement powers that would allow Nature Scot to regulate deer management activities on a piece of land to support nature restoration. Nature Scot told the committee how these new powers would enable it to mitigate the environmental impact of wild deer more effectively. On the other hand, we heard strong concerns from the deer management sector about the lack of detail around how and when the new intervention powers would be used. In weighing up both arguments, the committee considered that whilst it would be helpful for Nature Scot to have this proposed grounds for intervention in its toolkit, these powers should be used to complement, not replace, the voluntary work of our deer management groups and stockers who already play a key role in controlling deer numbers in their local areas. We were all clear that the Scottish Government must proceed with caution when rolling out new enforcement powers to avoid eroding the trust and collaboration that has already been carefully built between Nature Scot and deer management in recent years. The committee also agreed with expanding the role of the Register of Persons competent to shoot deer, but we do not want the Scottish Government to support non-certified stalkers with accessing the register through exploring the use of we do want the Scottish Government to support non-certified stalkers with assessing the register through exploring the use of grandfather rights and referee schemes as a way of demonstrating baseline competence. Finally, the committee had mixed views on the proposals in the bill to repeal the venison dealer licence. Although we support the Government's ambitions to increase the supply of venison entering the food chain, there were concerns about how the removal of the licence might impact on traceability. This information is crucial to consumer confidence in the venison industry and its produce. We recommend that the licence scheme is maintained until Nature Scot's deer application, which is currently in development, has been rolled out across Scotland and able to offer a suitable replacement for the traceability currently provided by the licence. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the committee supports the general principles of the bill, but we also agreed improvements are needed if the bill is going to be effective in achieving its core ambition of tackling the nature emergency in Scotland. We hope, therefore, that the Government engages constructively with the report findings as the bill progresses to ensure it is capable of delivering on its worthy aims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I now call on Tim Eagle to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I start, can I just remind members of my register of interests I do have a small farm up in Murray. After an eventful week with the Land Reform Bill, it brings a welcome change, actually, to discuss the Natural Environment Bill in today's debate. Before I set out my reservations, I want to emphasise that my concerns are not about the broad principle of enhancing and protecting our natural environment. I truly accept the importance of that, and for that matter, want to recognise and congratulate the many farmers, crofters and landowners which, through agri-environmental schemes, have been moving this forward for years. What I am concerned about is the need for this bill now, and especially the way in which it is being introduced in relation to the rural sector, traditional values, food production and its impact on local communities. In an attempt to take the bill in order of sections, let me first start with biodiversity targets. Now, by way of history, Scotland's first biodiversity strategy, Scotland's Biodiversity, It's in Your Hands, was published under a Labour government in 2004 and has been supplemented and revisited several times. It failed to meet its original 2010 targets. In 2013, under the SNP government, Scotland produced the 2020 Challenge for Scotland Biodiversity. The SNP managed to meet 9 of the 20 targets in that one, failing the rest. In response, the SNP produced the post-2020, a Statement of Intent, which paved the way for the 2045 strategy, which was released in draft in 2022 and finally published in November 2024. To be honest, I slightly lost the will to read any more about biodiversity strategies by this point. Now, it's interesting, it says on the SNP website, the SNP understand the need to take decisive action to conserve our precious and valuable marine environment and biodiversity. My word, if biodiversity is anything to go by, then it's no wonder that independence is so dead in the water. Here in 2025, 21 years of left-wing ideological governments later, we are still debating the same old ground and only now introducing statutory targets in a bill to hold ministers to account. And not because farmers and landowners and NGOs or anyone else were not ready and willing, but because the previous non-statutory approach undertaken by this government has been a failure. Targets will only be as good as the actions to deliver them, says one ENGO. Where are the assurances that we need on that? But rural communities, I think, do stand ready. For years, land managers, farmers, crofters, estate owners and local communities in Scotland's uplands and lowlands alike have been willing to engage, support biodiversity objectives and integrate nature-friendly practices, while also safeguarding food production, local economies and traditional rural values. Now, Part 2 of the bill was widely panned by those who came before the committee. The risk is that the extensive powers being proposed in relation to environmental impact assessments, regimes and the habitat regulations, among others, could lead to radical changes to protected sites. In the response to the Stage 1 report, ministers still wish to press ahead with Part 2, and whilst I am not against that, I fear they may face an uphill battle in securing the trust of rural communities. Part 3 of the bill looks to change the priorities for national parks and impose a duty on public bodies to facilitate the implementation of the national park plans. This is despite the fact that existing national parks in Scotland have never been comprehensively reviewed, and there are various concerns raised by local people regarding governance, economic impacts, land use and community rights. And then we get to Part 4 on deer management. Now, this section as drafted gives Nature Scot extremely broad powers to intervene in how deer are managed, often on vague or undefined grounds. It will, I believe, need significant amendments to bring clarity and proportionality to those powers. It is vital that Nature Scot must consider deer numbers and density in relation to their actual impact on the natural environment, avoiding unnecessary interference with responsible land management, and in so doing, it will be vital to ensure the grounds for intervention are tightened further in the bill. The bill as drafted currently allows action wherever deer prevent or reduce environmental work. At present, that strikes for me at being too broad. The same applies to the broad scope that allows intervention based on government targets, strategies and plans, where it should be clearly stated this should relate to deer management. The Code of Practice on deer management is a vital document to ensure ministers, Nature Scot and land managers work proactively together. Whilst ideally it should have been produced and debated during the Stage 1 discussions, I can at least recognise that only allowing Nature Scot to have regard to the code is too weak. Surely a code that aims to bring people together must mean Nature Scot should comply with it so far as reasonably practical, so decisions are transparent and consistent. Yes.
Emma Harper.
Some of the challenges, I think, in deer management is there's a difference in Highland deer management versus lowland deer management, and I think my understanding was the code of practice, in order to be developed, would allow flexibility for different practice to be enabled between the Highlands and lowland deer management processes.
Tim Eagle.
Actually, I agree with that. I think there is a big difference between upland and lowland deer management, and it is essential the Code of Practice recognises that and takes it forward. But ideally, we could have had that document, I think, earlier. It's a bit like what we had in the Agricultural and Rural Communities Bill. Now, there are several improvements that could be made in regards to control schemes, which I will likely bring forward at Stage 2. Yeah, I probably could, actually, yeah.
Mr. Minister?
I just want to ask the member if his need for urgency to have it delivered before the Stage 1 debate, when we still have Stage 2 and Stage 3 to go, is bigger imperative than getting it right.
Tim Eagle?
It's not, actually, and I'll accept that. It's not about not getting it right. It's about having all the information at our hands early on so that we can be sure we're making the right debates and discussions as early on in the bill as possible. And that was the same with the Rural Support Plan, which, FYI, we're still waiting for. Now, the Stage 1 report warned that the government risks eroding the trust within the deer management sector, and I urge the government to work to protect that. Very quickly, I just wanted to highlight the letter that the Minister for Agriculture sent this morning to the RAI committee that is around grouse moor licensing schemes that were only agreed actually recently in the Wildlife and Muirburn Act. The argument being is it's not working as intended. My understanding is there is absolutely no evidence to support that at this point, and amendments like that risk potentially further broadening what is already a very broad bill and will require significant debate at Stage 2. And whilst I recognise the Minister of Agriculture's right to do that, I do hope the Minister is prepared to facilitate as much consultation and discussion as we can on that. Now, while the Conservative group will support the principles of this bill today, I do so with some reservations about how the legislation may progress. Our concern is that without proper partnership, respect for rural livelihoods and food security, the bill risks being a source of tension rather than collaboration. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call on Sarah Boyack to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open for Scottish Labour today to give my support for the principles of this bill, but to highlight that we need to see that the gaps in the legislation are understood and addressed. Because as we face the twin nature and climate crisis, this bill represents an important step towards restoring Scotland's natural environment and protecting it for generations to come. So I do want to thank the committee, the clerks and all those who gave evidence to the committee in advance of their recommendations, and also those who issued briefings, a range of organisations, on how we could strengthen the bill. And I think, to start off, the introduction of statutory nature recovery targets is a vital move, and one that I strongly support, because targets, when meaningful and properly implemented, can deliver action, focus investment and give clarity to communities. And I think it's really significant that 3/4 of the Scottish public support legal targets for nature recovery. And as the RSPB said in their briefing, 1 in 9 species are at risk of national extinction in Scotland, and we are one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. So if we're serious about halting biodiversity loss and reversing the damage done to our land, our coast and our seas, we need clear, ambitious and measurable goals, because the decline in nature is ongoing and we've had voluntary targets since the 90s, so we need change. Now, in relation to the different elements of the bill, while I support the overarching ambition and many of the measures proposed, there are areas that need to be strengthened if we're to see the real tangible progress, and we cannot afford slow implementation. The urgency of the nature crisis demands evidence-based policy intervention and clarity from the government for our communities now. I'm proud to have been the Minister to introduce our first national parks, and I know first-hand the importance of strong frameworks empowering local leadership while maintaining national consistency. And I saw the transformative potential of local engagement in managing and restoring wildlife. If it's brief.
Maurice Golden.
Thank the member for taking an intervention. On national parks, does the member agree that we need to actually define what one looks like so we can have a meaningful consultation with communities?
Sarah Boyd.
Well, I think defining boundaries, yes, that's important, but it's also about giving national parks the support, if they're going to fulfil their full potential, to lead in nature recovery, sustainable development and community empowerment. So there's work needs to be done. And I believe ministers should publish a national parks policy framework, setting out a clear vision on how Scotland's national parks can contribute to nature recovery targets and climate commitments. And that should also include guidance for public bodies and officials on how to fulfil this new duty in the bill to seek to further national park aims. And one of the things I want to raise is that we should ensure that enforcement is not the first response to minor bylaw infringements. We should emphasise education, community engagement and practical support, because our national parks are hugely important to the public, and with the right vision and accountability, they can become leading examples of nature restoration, climate resilience, sustainable tourism and food production in action. When it comes to the nature targets themselves, I want to stress that our approach mustn't overlook species. Achieving the goal of 30 by 30 will need meaningful dialogue with our rural and island communities, because there are residents in the Highlands and Islands specifically who feel that their land should both be protected, but it should also be their land, and we've been debating that this week. Now, Scottish Labour is very keen to propose amendments at stage 2. I personally am keen to amend the section on marine and coastal habitats, because these ecosystems are critical for both our biodiversity and climate mitigation, but their ability to sequester carbon and build resilience depends on reducing pressures caused by our activities. So our legislative approach must reflect the need for adaptation as well as mitigation, recognising that nature and climate policies are deeply intertwined. Now, I thought it was very interesting in her opening comments that the Cabinet Secretary reflected on Part 2 of the bill, because it grants ministers sweeping enabling powers to amend the 2 cornerstone pillars of environmental protection, the Habitats Regulations and the Environmental Impact Assessment legislation. The EIA regime covers numerous sectors, including agriculture, forestry, marine licensing, planning and flood management, and without maintaining the same standards, it's concerning that we could see standards undermined. And stakeholders across the environmental and planning sectors have expressed deep unease about the breadth of these powers. And without robust safeguards, there's a real risk of regression in environmental standards, and that is something we just cannot allow. So I have been looking at the issue of having a non-regression clause to guarantee that existing protections won't be weakened, because the urgency of our nature crisis leaves no room for going backwards. So I welcome the fact the Cabinet Secretary is reflecting on the risks that have been raised by stakeholders and the committee, but we need to make sure that the powers in Part 2 are going to build public trust, not undermine accountability and decision-making. So, Presiding Officer, Scotland has the opportunity through this bill to show leadership not only in setting nature recovery targets, but in delivering them and demonstrating how democratic, inclusive policy making can give real outcomes for people and our planet. Because in the last decade alone, 43% of our species have declined. So this is a now issue, and this bill must deliver on its promise that sets us firmly on a path to restore Scotland's natural environment, protect our iconic landscapes and species, and empower communities to be at the heart of nature recovery. With the right amendments, with stronger ability, this bill can help us move from ambition to action, and I look forward to working constructively to make sure it actually does that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call on Mark Ruskell to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, at long last, the Natural Environment Bill has been introduced to this Parliament, and really not a moment too soon, because we are deeper than ever in the nature emergency. We all know that Scotland's nature in crisis. We all know that 1 in 9 of our species are at risk of extinction in Scotland. And of course, conservation of what we have left is important, but we need to move beyond drawing lines on maps. This is now the time for the biggest restoration of our land and seas ever seen in our nation's history. And I'm excited about what this means for species and habitats that will be able to connect, expand and thrive. But I'm also excited for people, especially for a generation of young people today who deserve the opportunity to make their mark on our nation's story, to help restore and revive our land and seas, to plant and nurture the future, to shift Scotland's environmental baselines up rather than down. This is the moment to ensure action for nature is given parity with the drive to achieve net zero. They are the sides of the same coin. That need for action should be reflected in the title of this bill. It should arguably be a nature emergency bill, rooted in action, rooted in restoration, not only conservation. So on these benches, we're glad to see legally binding targets for nature recovery being introduced. This is what Greens pushed for when we were in government. And in committee, we heard so many supportive arguments for targets from academics, NGOs, land management and infrastructure sectors. It's clear that a rudderless, voluntary approach has not worked. It has not brought the focus needed in a nature emergency. If there's time in hand, I will...
well, there's brief time in hand.
Briefly, please, Mr Reeve.
Make the point on the biodiversity targets that do you agree with Open Seas when they said in their response to this that actually targets are only worthwhile if the actions behind them are truly achievable?
Always through the chair, Mark Ruskell.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what my colleague Lorna Slater was working on through the biodiversity strategy when she was in government, and the delivery plans that are still to come through. Targets in themselves are not a silver bullet. Multi-year finance is critical, and those delivery plans are absolutely critical as well, and they need to flow from the targets that are being set in this bill. Now, while Scottish Greens want the target provisions in the bill, we think that it can and it should go further. These targets need to recommit to our international obligations to restore 30% of our seas and land by 2030. But, Presiding Officer, there could not be more of a contrast between what is in Part 1 of the bill and what is in Part 2. Part 2, as currently drafted, is wholly inappropriate for legislation that is attempting to tackle the nature emergency. How can the government give the power to itself and all future governments to water down European laws that have protected our nature from destruction for over 40 years? Now, the government has said it is committed to not using the Part 2 powers in the short term. So why introduce such wide-ranging powers in the first place? And we know that there are sectors from fish farming to agriculture to property developers who would love to strip away some nature protections and gut environmental assessments. And this has been exactly what the Labour UK government has enthusiastically started in England with the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. It must not happen here. Witness after witness coming to committee talked about how these laws are fundamental and vitally important to nature protection. And there were huge concerns about the use of these powers to rewrite the laws, especially when there is no non-regression clause to act as a backstop against environmental destruction. And it was really hard to find any evidence at all about how a weakened environmental assessment regime would speed up climate action on renewable energy. The current regime is clear, well understood by the sector, and as the case of Berwick Bank offshore wind farm shows, government already has more than enough latitude within consenting regimes to make choices. Government simply hasn't come to Parliament with any convincing reasons at all as to why these powers are needed. It's time to hold on to our foundational nature protection laws, and that's why Greens are minded to remove Part 2 of the bill when it returns to committee, although I would welcome the discussion with the Cabinet Secretary around how Part 2 could potentially be amended. On Part 3 in national parks, we support the intentions in the bill, especially the clearer focus needed from all public agencies to deliver democratically agreed park plans. And maybe if Scottish Enterprise had respected Loch Lomond, the Trossachs National Park plan early doors, we wouldn't have had the debacle over Flamingo Land. Of course, it's a massive missed opportunity that all the benefits of national parks will now not be felt in Galloway. A review on national parks is needed, the designation process, what they've achieved over the last 20 years, their current boundaries, and this Parliament clearly should have a key role in that review. On Part 4 concerning deer management, again, we're supportive of the Government's intentions to finally implement the conclusions of the Deer Management Working Group, but there is more that can and should be done. Deer overgrazing is a huge limit on nature recovery and climate action. And if we want to see thriving Atlantic rainforests, restored peatlands, better deer welfare, we need a modern system of deer management. Enhancing Nature Scott's powers further to act quickly where deer numbers get out of control is critical. Nature Scott need to use the new powers. But there also needs to be options to consider the role of other public bodies, such as Forestry and Land Scotland, who could step into that role should Nature Scotland fail. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the Scottish Greens will support this bill at Stage 1, but it must be legislation fit for tackling a nature emergency. We will be looking for a wide range of changes and additions at Stage 2, and I look forward to working with the Government to address concerns and to make this bill fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. I now call on Beatrice Wishart to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And my thanks to the committee clerks and all the witnesses and stakeholders who contributed to the Stage 1 process. Scottish Liberal Democrats believe that more needs to be done to halt and reverse the decline of many of Scotland's important species, and we recognise that the climate crisis and biodiversity loss are not separate issues but are deeply intertwined. The Natural Environment Bill presents an opportunity for action, a chance to create legally binding targets for nature recovery, to modernise the regulatory framework for deer management and restore ecosystems. For these reasons, Scottish Liberal Democrats will support the general principles of the bill at Stage 1. But there are, however, a number of areas which could benefit from changes. My party and I are in broad agreement with the use of legally binding targets for improving biodiversity, though we should be wary of any unintended consequences. As the Stage 1 report highlights, targets must be evidence-based with robust data, and as stakeholders have highlighted, the lack of explicit links to the marine environment is noticeable. While the bill requires Scottish ministers to specify how progress towards targets is to be measured, further detail is needed on how they will ensure targets are robust and that there is sufficient resource available. Targets are only useful when meaningful action is taken to deliver them. Almost half of Scotland's species have decreased in number since the 1970s. 1 in 9 species are at risk of national extinction in Scotland, and that's quite a sobering statistic. Invasive non-native species are one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss in Scotland, and the bill is a chance to legislate for action to address this issue. Non-native game birds bred in captivity and released in large numbers can cause damage to sensitive habitats and have been subject to several mass mortality events caused by the highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, in recent years. This poses serious risks to native wildlife. There's been an increase in novel releases of non-native species to sensitive island ecosystems, including in Shetland, where wild birds are more seriously impacted by HPAI than almost anywhere else in Europe. I understand that game birds released in Shetland may not even have been registered on the Scotland Kept Birds Register, despite this being a legal requirement. And given this situation, I ask the Cabinet Secretary to consider the call for Scottish ministers to have stronger powers to regulate the release of game birds. Those who plant or manage woodland should also take steps to reduce and mitigate the spread of non-native tree species. The committee heard strong concerns from many stakeholders about Part 2 of the bill. Stakeholders emphasised the importance of environmental impact assessments, or EIA legislation, and the habitats regulations in protecting Scotland's natural environment and biodiversity. I share concerns that the bill would allow for a very wide scope of these regimes to be amended by Scottish ministers. While our current government may state they have no intention to dilute or weaken environmental standards and protections, they cannot speak for future governments. The law needs better safeguards, such as a non-regression provision and stronger parliamentary scrutiny. I note the calls from some stakeholders to remove Part 2 entirely, and I look forward to seeing what the Cabinet Secretary brings forward at Stage 2 to address these concerns. Turning now to the bill's section on deer management, the intention to modernise the Deer Scotland 1996 Act is welcome. Increasing deer numbers in Scotland and damaged habitats prevents nature restoration in some areas. The bill's success depends on working with those who undertake deer management, which is largely voluntary. This voluntary deer management is vital, and it's important when bringing in changes that the trust and consensus built within the sector is not affected. To that end, it's important to consider the areas that the sector have raised as concerning. Deer management organisations raised the lack of detail on how the new nature restoration grounds for intervention will be used in practice. The criteria to be detailed in the Deer Code, which is not due to be until after the bill completes the parliamentary process. So I echo calls for the draft revised Deer Code to be ready for consultation as soon as possible to enable stakeholders and parliamentarians to have sight of the proposals during the bill's process. Mandatory training requirements will have impacts on deer management practitioners and training providers. The Scottish Government must ensure that training is proportionate and that there is support in place for transition, including looking at grandfather rights and other mechanisms, to avoid a loss of specialist skills and expertise in the sector. On the repeal of the venison dealer licence, I reiterate the committee's call for the current system to be maintained until the Nature Scot app is fully tested and rolled out, and for opportunities for expanding the wild venison sector to be explored. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, while this bill presents opportunities for action for climate and nature, improvements are needed, and I look forward to working constructively with the Scottish Government on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We will now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 6 minutes. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson. Alistair Allen.
Presiding Officer, the bill before us today is the product of extensive and patient engagement by the Cabinet Secretary and her bill team, as well as work from the committee and its clerks, and all of that should be recognised from the outset today. The bill will help support the ongoing work of the Scottish Government and many other stakeholders across Scotland in tackling the twin crises of climate change and nature loss, issues of which I am acutely aware, for many other reasons, as the nature champion for the great yellow bumblebee. The provisions within the bill aim to support the work already being undertaken by land managers, farmers, crofters, nature agencies, charities and the other stewards of our land to restore and protect the natural environment on which everyone in Scotland depends. Presiding Officer, other members have spoken and will speak about the first three parts of the bill, which cover targets for improving biodiversity, environmental impact assessment and habitat regulations and national parks. These, I believe, are all very positive measures, but I intend to concentrate my remarks today on Part 4 of the bill. Part 4 is of particular interest to many of my constituents as it relates to deer management, with provisions for controlling deer populations and addressing deer-related damage, along with measures to prevent harm and to enforce existing regulations. Specifically, the bill allows Nature Scot to intervene where insufficient deer management is impeding projects or natural processes which serve to improve or restore the natural environment. Another change to deer legislation is the removal of the need for a licence to deal in venison to stimulate the small-scale local venison market and make local venison more affordable and accessible. And Scotland should certainly be promoting the wider sale of venison, given its quality and availability. Presiding Officer, excessive deer numbers often represent a significant threat to the livelihoods of tenant farmers and crofters through damage to crops, grazings, woodlands and habitats. Deer can also be a host for ticks, which can carry a range of diseases that can infect both humans and livestock. So, tenant farmers and crofters, who between them manage around 35% of Scotland's agricultural land, including common grazings. Crofters and tenant farmers very often live and work in areas of concentrated land ownership and, in some cases, have landlords with sporting interests. So there can potentially be a tension between estates which want to keep shooting rights and tenants who have to deal with the damage deer can wreak if uncontrolled. And this is, I suspect, an issue which will be a live one as the bill progresses through Parliament. Under current legislation, occupiers of land, including tenant farmers and tenant crofters, have the right to cull deer only on improved land where deer damage occurs, but not on unimproved land such as moorland, sea cliffs and hill grazings. The occupier is not permitted to cull deer on the unimproved land, which is the primary natural habitat for deer. The Deer Working Group, therefore, in their final report recommended that the Deer Scotland Act 1996 should be amended so that the statutory rights of occupiers to prevent damage by wild deer should apply to any type of land. Presiding Officer, while, as I say, I suspect that we will return to discuss that very specific issue, I believe that this bill is a very positive step for Scotland's biodiversity, environment and rural communities, and I would commend all sections of the bill to the Chamber.
Thank you, Dr Allen. And I call Jamie Harcourt-Johnson to be followed by Emma Harper in 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The bill before us today is essentially a 4-in-1, result of several consultations from 2023 onwards. And the broader issue of protecting and enhancing our natural environment is one that finds some agreement around this chamber. But it's clear that since its initial publication, this bill has raised some serious questions amongst stakeholders. To turn to part one, we welcome a focus on biodiversity. But as the Scottish Government alludes to in its policy memorandum, we have had 21 years of strategy, but little of any general improvement in Scotland's biodiversity. Scotland's capacity for action on restoring and improving biodiversity is perhaps greater than any other part of the United Kingdom, yet in many ways we've been left behind on the issue. However, we're not simply calling for pushing on. An effective and sustainable approach on biodiversity will need a government that is realistic about the balance to be struck with many competing objectives this government has. To take one example, the Scottish Government has recognised Scotland is in a housing crisis. In my region, many people, particularly young people, find themselves priced out of housing. Despite this, it seems unable to do anything meaningful to put house building on track to address the shortage of supply. Regulation and additional costs have strangled a great deal of potential development that is not only positive but necessary. We would not want to see biodiversity requirements become a hurdle or a barrier to delivering desperately needed homes, and we cannot load yet more regulation on top of these objectives. We've seen how many metrics of biodiversity net gain have been utilised elsewhere, and the prospect for off-site delivery for developers, which can help to balance the competing needs of development and enhancing the natural environment. Equally, we must consider the balance with food production and agriculture, and I remind the Chamber of my register of interest as a partner in a farming business. As Tim Eagle hinted at, many farms have made great strides in terms of biodiversity in recent years, but we have too often been left to proceed alone due to a lack of advice or cooperation from the Scottish Government. I recognise significant biodiversity gains can be found in agriculture, but it cannot serve to be just another government-directed mandate against struggling farmers. Part 3 of the bill concerning the management of national parks gives a significant amount of focus to the use of fixed penalty notices to enforce national park bylaws. Bylaws have not been extensively utilised by the national park authorities in the past, but can be a useful tool in ensuring these areas are used responsibly. We should perhaps not go too far in seeing this as a solution. The powers are already there to refer offences to the Procurator Fiscal and for fiscal fines to be issued to offenders after the event alongside other potential disposals. Where park rangers can issue FPNs under the Environmental Protection Act 1990, these powers are not regularly used. But given the established powers and the experience of park rangers in issuing FPNs For other matters, mainly fly tipping and littering, the ability to enforce bylaws in this way will remove an anomaly in enforcement powers. It should, however, lead to a wider question around enforcement and what more can be done to ensure that those using the parks do so in a way that is appropriate. We should be asking what resources are required to police these national parks, protect their natural heritage and ensure that antisocial behaviour is constrained. We're all aware that offences in national parks, as well as in other rural areas, are going unpunished. Too often, a minority are causing significant problems, whether it be starting dangerous fires that risk creating wildfires, damaging camping practices, or the issues around camper vans and particularly waste disposal. I hear directly how these issues can have a huge impact on communities across the Highlands and Islands, and national park authorities, local authorities and the police will have to work closely to combat them. And while this bill enhances the legal powers available, it will be down to the Scottish Government to ensure that these new powers are part of a package of measures that recognise the scale and extent of crime in rural and national park settings and resource efforts to tackle them appropriately. I won't, I'm afraid. To turn to Part 4, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has recognised the approach on deer management isn't working. The same, of course, could be said of the management of many other species, which sadly won't have the same focus. I think particularly on the continuing issues with grey-lag geese, hooded crows, blackback gulls and a whole range of damaging species where management has very visibly failed, and livestock and crops and, of course, farmers directly pay the price. Culling at a scale is a necessary step. The bill recognises and addresses issues around biodiversity, but serious inroads are needed on deer management as part of that process. Nature Scotland believes that at least another 50,000 deer will need to be culled annually to meet that figure, to meet biodiversity targets. And while that figure is obviously disputed by some, by many, one is entirely unrealistic without the other. More than this, however, the impact of poor deer management is greater than the impact on biodiversity and habitats. The effect on agriculture and the rising numbers of ticks spreading disease to animals and humans should concern us all. I appreciate a great deal of the impact here will go beyond legislation, but we already have landowners and those involved in the management of land pointing out that there is little clarity in the bill over how the new system will operate. Not least of this is the calls for the openness on the proposed new code of practice to enable effective scrutiny. But the Scottish Government should be worried when organisations like BASC are highlighting the potential of the measures that are in the bill to reduce the number of deer stalkers by half as a result of placing more regulatory burdens on their activities. It seems clear that despite the discussions on the Deer Working Group, there is a real need to build more effective relations between the Scottish Government, Nature Scot and stakeholders on the ground. Presiding Officer, this bill sets out with reasonable intentions and the need to bring together several areas under one bill, but it fails to live up to what it suggests and make a real impact on preserving and enhancing our natural environment. Some provisions are welcome, but if it's passed today, it is clear it will be down to the Scottish Government to ensure they are successful in implementation. What it risks is creating biodiversity targets that don't work and instead harm the Government's other objectives. New enforcement powers for national parks where offences aren't enforced, and a new approach to deer management that leads or risks leading to chaos in the sector. Avoiding these outcomes is possible, but it will require a level of commitment and engagement from the Scottish Government that has sadly not demonstrated so far.
Thank you. Just to advise the Chamber, we have a bit of time in hand, so certainly time will be given back for any interventions. And with that, I call Emma Harper to be followed by Rhoda Grant. A generous 6 minutes.
Generous. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Rural Committee, I welcome the opportunity to speak in the Stage 1 report on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. And I thank the committee clerks and all of the witnesses who contributed and gave us evidence, and of course the Bill team and the Government Ministers as well. This legislation presents a vital opportunity to address the nature emergency and biodiversity loss in Scotland through statutory targets, improved deer management and the reform of our national park system. So I'm going to begin, Presiding Officer, with the issue of biodiversity and habitat targets. Scotland's biodiversity is in decline, as we've heard that already this afternoon. Wading birds such as curlew, lapwing and oystercatcher are emblematic of this crisis. Their wetland, moorland and grassland habitats are under huge pressure from land use change, climate impacts and predation. and that's why many species are already red listed. I've worked with a local farmer in the Glen Kens area and other concerned stakeholders since February to seek and deliver ways to address the reduction in these iconic birds, and we now have a good network of people who wish to be included in any action that is taken forward. Presiding Officer, I've been the nature champion for the Natterjack toad for almost 10 years now, and I am the small ponds and lochs champion too. And I've witnessed for myself the vulnerabilities of our habitats in my South Scotland region as part of being a nature champion. And the committee's report is clear. Voluntary approaches have not delivered. Our committee report states that the committee agrees that the rate of nature loss in Scotland over recent decades is deeply concerning. The voluntary approach to biodiversity targets taken to date has not managed to halt or reverse biodiversity declines. So I therefore support the introduction of statutory targets. These must be more than aspirational. They must be actionable, measurable and backed by resources. Our committee report notes that targets in themselves are not a silver bullet, and the convener has mentioned that as well. And whether they're statutory or not, they must be accompanied by meaningful actions, reinforced by sufficient public resources in order to ensure they are achievable. The bill proposes 3 mandatory target areas under Section 2C: the condition or extent of any habitat, the status of threatened species, and there's been discussion around that language already as well, and the environmental conditions for nature regeneration. This is a strong foundation. Our report also highlighted that Scottish ministers may also set targets in relation to any other matter relating to the restoration or regeneration of biodiversity as they consider appropriate. So it may be an action for the Scottish Government to include species-specific indicators. This may include breeding success rates for wading birds. This could ensure that our targets reflect ecological realities and guide effective interventions, although I know that any action cannot be applied in a siloed approach. My next point, Presiding Officer, is regarding Part 4 of the bill, deer management. Others have mentioned this already, but particularly in lowland areas, for me, I think it's important to highlight. Scotland's deer population, while iconic, is increasingly problematic. In lowland and peri-urban areas, deer are contributing to habitat degradation, agricultural damage and even road safety concerns. Alistair Allen mentioned the Scottish Tenant Farmers, and I've been doing work alongside them to highlight the impacts that the tenant farmers have on deer encroaching into their unimproved land, but also in their property as well. The committee heard that current powers are insufficient to address these challenges, and the bill introduces a new nature restoration criterion under Section 6, allowing NatureScot to intervene where deer are impeding biodiversity recovery. This is a welcome step. However, stakeholders... Yes, Douglas Ross.
Douglas Ross.
I'm very grateful to Emma Harper for giving way. She may have heard my intervention on the Cabinet Secretary earlier about some of the concerns that were raised with the committee about the extension of the role of NatureScot under Part 4 of this bill. In response, the Cabinet Secretary rightly said this bill is not about NatureScot, but would the member accept that this is perhaps our final legislative opportunity in this Parliament to make some changes to NatureScot for those of us who do have concerns about their conflicted duties as being both in charge of preserving bird, deer, animal numbers, but also in charge of the licences to control them?
Emma Harper, I can give you the time back.
Okay, thanks, Presiding Officer, and thank you, Douglas Ross, for that. I think if we're looking at potential secondary stage 2 amendments, that might be something that the member can bring forward in order to clarify what the concerns are about NatureScot. So that will be something that any member in this Parliament could take forward if they so choose. So, stakeholders expressed concern about the powers that would be applied, and as noted in our report, it states that the committee recommends that the criteria for intervention under Section 6ZB should be clearly set out in the revised Deer Code, and this code should be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. Transparency and collaboration are key, Presiding Officer. Deer managers have built trust through voluntary efforts, and we must preserve that relationship. Clear guidance, robust data collection, especially in lowland areas, and inclusive decision-making will be absolutely essential. We've heard about promotion and consumption of venison and venison-combined pork products. That's already underway in some areas. We've heard about good examples in primary schools on Jura, and I believe NHS and Fries and Galloway are also adding venison and venison products to their menus. Finally, Presiding Officer, I will address the process for establishing new national parks, and I will be really quick. The bill proposes reforms to the aims and governance of national parks. While I support these changes, the experience of the Galloway National Park proposals, which didn't proceed in my South Scotland region, highlights the need for a more inclusive and transparent process. There was strong local feelings expressed for and against the proposal, and there was concerns raised about land use restrictions and governments, and the fact that Dumfries and Galloway is a highly food-producing and economically important to the South West Scotland region. So the committee rightly, I don't think I have time, Presiding Officer, the committee rightly calls for a clearer guidance on how national park plans will be implemented and how competing aims such as conservation, recreation and economic development will be balanced. Presiding Officer, the bill is a turning point. It gives us the tools to restore nature, manage our landscapes responsibly and engage communities in shaping their future. But this legislation needs to not just work alone. We need collaboration, clarity and commitment. So I support the principles of this bill because Scotland's nature deserves nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I now call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Evelyn Tweed. Again, a generous 6 minutes, Ms Grant.
Thank you. Can I also add my thanks to those who provided evidence to the committee on the bill and also to the support staff of the committee who helped in our deliberations. And as others are doing, they're name-checking that they are nature champions. So I need to name-check the wildcat, for which I am the nature champion, and also pay tribute to the work of the Highland Wildlife Park and the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland have done huge work in reintroducing and breeding in captivity and reintroducing to the wild wildcats who have continued to breed in the wild. So that is really a good news story, and hopefully they can continue to build upon that. Presiding Officer, as others have said, the bill has 4 distinct parts. Part 1 on targets appears largely uncontroversial, albeit that it will need strengthening at stage 2. Part 2, however, as others have said, has caused much greater concern to those who give evidence, gives unprecedented powers to Scottish ministers to modify environmental impact assessment legislation and habitat regulations. Many of those who gave evidence were concerned that the powers were far too broad. Stakeholders argued that ministers already had powers to amend these regimes and that these powers currently worked well. They give enough flexibility for different features to be protected. Powers also allowed for the features that could no longer be protected, often due to issues out with our control, such as climate change, where the feature which had been protected was no longer there. It gave powers to alter the designations. They believe that those powers create the right balance and provide enough flexibility in any circumstance. The Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management told the committee that habitats regulations were more flexible than indicated by government, albeit that flexibility was often underused. And they give the example of an example in my own constituency of the Mallaig to Fort William Road upgrade, where there was a loss of oak wood in a special area of conservation, but that was allowed because of the public interest in upgrading the road. Others cited the flexibility contained in the Energy Act, which had the power to make change for renewables and electricity infrastructure. The keeping pace power, which this section seeks to replace, is due to expire and could be extended or replaced in a much more constrained fashion. I am glad that the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary in her speech today has said that she acknowledges that there are issues with this and will look at bringing forward amendments at stage 2, and we look forward to seeing those amendments because, as others have said, if it is not amended, then we may need to look to removing that section.
Mark Roscoe.
Can I thank the member for giving way? That issue about keeping pace is important. Would you agree that one way to tackle that would be to ensure that the sunset clause on the continuity bill is removed so that we can continue to update European legislation that protects the environment in this place?
Rhoda Grant.
That was one of a number of suggestions given to the committee, and I think we'll need to scrutinise what comes forward. But what is very clear is something has to change from the way that the bill is currently drafted to give that protections, and I think we have an open mind as to how that that happens, because our legislation needs to be future-proofed, and it's right that there has to be checks and balances in place. We also know that apologies, but can I move on to part 3 of the bill? The part 3 of the bill updates the aims of national parks, and like Sarah Boyack, I was involved on the committee that looked at the initial, while Sarah Boyack was the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, I was on the committee that scrutinised the original national park legislation. And like her, I remember many difficult debates and negotiations that were needed to get the balances right for the aims of national parks. And no one really gave a substantial reason for the changes that are in the bill, and this is my personal view, that I feel that if it doesn't need to be changed for any particular reason, then maybe leave it as it is, because these aims have borne the test of time. And I fear that any change may rebalance the aims and lead to conflict. When we first introduced national parks, there was a clamour to have them in different areas, and yet that clamour seems to have disappeared. Indeed, the government's attempt to create another national park has failed. So instead of changing the aims, maybe we should look at how our national parks are meeting our aspirations, post-legislative scrutiny perhaps, looking at our community aspirations that are in our existing national parks, helping them to flourish. And I think that would be a way of encouraging others to look at developing national parks in their areas. Part 4 of the bill looks at deer management, and we know that if we manage deer properly, the investment we put into natural forest regeneration may not be required, because forests will regenerate themselves naturally if we remove the deer pressure. However, we must reduce deer numbers. But when we do that, we have to have animal welfare at the very heart of that, because that is so important that we do this properly and that we do not waste the venison created from the cull of deer, because we've heard about initiatives in Duran and other places where that venison is making its way into school meals and is providing nutrition to young people in our schools. We need to learn from that and make sure that happens going forward, and that we don't have waste from deer being culled. Presiding Officer, we very much welcome this bill and look to supporting it, but we want to work with government to bring forward amendments that improve it in the future, and hopefully we can do that at stage 2.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Evelyn Tweed to be followed by Jackie Dunbar. Again, generous 6 minutes. Ms Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to give us evidence on this bill. The bill is wide-ranging, and today I will focus on proposals for a fixed penalty regime for national park bylaws, which comes under Part 3 of the bill. Many of my constituents live and work in Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park. It provides many opportunities to engage with the natural world, and it's a marvellous place. If you haven't been there, please come. With over 4 million visitors each year, it is important to consider and manage the impact on those who live locally, as well as on the environment. Bylaws play an important role in this. The Law Society of Scotland explain that bylaws can be used by national parks to protect their natural and cultural heritage, prevent damage to the land and secure public enjoyment and safety. Loch Lomond in the Trossachs NPA has had bylaws restricting camping on the banks of many of its lochs since 2017 and safety regulations for water activities at Loch Lomond since 2023. The Cairngorms National Park has introduced bylaws on fire management with a view to reducing the risk of wildfires. Education and engagement are at the fore of bylaw enforcement. Loch Lomond and the Trossachs NPA explained to the committee that when their rangers have conversations with visitors who are breaking bylaws, many are happy to adjust their behaviour and do the right thing. However, in 12 out of nearly 900 cases last year, that conversation did not work. And these cases were referred to the Procurator Fiscal, causing a huge administrative burden for the National Park. Section 9 of the Natural Environment Bill addresses this with an enabling power to introduce fixed penalty notices for the enforcement of national park bylaws, which is considered to be a more efficient, effective and proportionate means of enforcement. Although
I think on the National Park fixed penalties, I think actually that was quite uncontentious within the committee. But what was very contentious in the committee was part 2 of the bill around the changes to habitat regulations. And do you think, I was wondering if the member thought it was telling that neither Evelyn Tweed, Emma Harper or Alistair Halland have mentioned that today? And is that because actually there is nothing that can come forward that protects the habitat regulations?
Evelyn Tweed.
No, that's absolutely not the case, but thank you for your intervention. Although these proposals have been welcomed, several stakeholders have expressed the need for caution. Scottish Environment Link noted the risk of stricter enforcement within national parks displacing problem behaviour beyond the park's boundaries and creating a two-tier system. Many popular locations and important habitats lie beyond our national parks, so this is a concern, and I am keen to hear how the Government will mitigate and monitor any unintended consequences that may arise. I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary describe the fixed penalty regime as supplementary to the Rangers' role of engagement and education, but several organisations asked for guidance and monitoring to ensure this remains the case. The committee seeks details on what guidance the Scottish Government intends to provide to NPAs as they formulate their approach. The mixed penalty is set at £500, and I note that the financial memorandum states that Loch Lomond and Trossachs NPA has proposed fines of around £80 and deemed this as appropriate for a level for by-law fines. However, the Law Society have highlighted the need to make sure that there is consistency with other fixed penalty schemes to ensure that the landscape is simple and does not lead to confusion amongst the public. There has been suggestion that a fixed penalty regime could cover parking infractions, and I am very keen to explore this further. Irresponsible parking in visitor hotspots is a huge issue in my area, and this summer saw serious overcrowding and reckless parking on verges at Loch Lubnig and other areas. NPAs did not think that they had the key legal rights at the present time to make bylaws bite. I know my constituents would welcome more enforcement powers in this area, and I asked the Government to work with the National Park authorities on this ahead of stage 2, and also consider the role that local authorities and the police might have in this area. To conclude, Presiding Officer, on the whole, the committee held support for this change, and I look forward to hearing how issues will be addressed at stage 2. And finally, I support the general principles of the bill. And for the record, I am also the nature champion for the rare azure hawker dragonfly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Jude. We now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Jackie Dunbar. Again, a generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm not going to need a generous 6 minutes, I'm afraid, but I will declare that I am the nature's champion for the sea trout. Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the favourite phrases of my party is "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." 58 years later, while support for independence has a healthy 10-point lead in the polls, the world isn't in quite so great a place and is facing both climate and biodiversity crises. This bill today is a part of how Scotland is going to respond to those crises and how we will play our part in tackling global challenges across Scotland and in the communities that we represent. Basically, it's about how we think global and act local. Tackling the climate emergency is already a priority of our Scottish Government, but increasingly extreme weather isn't just about sad polar bears up at the North Pole. It's impacting on Scotland already. We're seeing it with the likes of Storm Arwen and Hurricane Bobag, and we're seeing it in floods. And for the first time in a very long time, water shortages. In our country, where it often feels like it just never stops raining. All of that is obviously going to have an impact on our natural environment, and that in turn is affecting biodiversity across Scotland. That's before you factor in the impact of what's actually happening in Scotland itself. Agriculture, forestry, grazing, both farm animals and wild animals, peatland degradation, overfishing, invasive species and new building developments, whether that be for housing or commercial uses, have over time added to the strain being placed on biodiversity in Scotland. We now have a situation where Scotland ranks 212th out of 240 countries in the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and where 11% of species in Scotland are at risk of extinction. That needs to change. So here today, I'm pleased it appears we're going to come together as a Parliament and unite behind the principles of how we improve that, so we can have an ecosystem that is strong and stable. I'm sure once we all agree the principle that there should be targets for improving biodiversity, that we can go back to fiercely debating exactly what those targets should be and how they should be measured and how they should be met. I'll take an intervention from Mr.
Thank you for the member to give way. I think my colleague Tim Eagle touched on this as well. There is general consensus about the reason for having this Natural Environment Bill, but without exception, every single stakeholder suggested that Part 2 put nature at risk. Yet we've not heard that from any of the SNP contributions. Can you set out why you think Part 2 is needed and whether the safeguards are in place that would be required?
Through the Chair, Emma Harper. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure there will be many amendments come forward to Stage 2, Mr Carson, and I will leave it to your committee to make sure that... Sorry, Presiding Officer, I've just got... I'm just doing what I was told myself, anyway. And, anyway, I'm equally sure that should any of those targets be missed, whoever is in government will have their feet held firmly to the fire by whoever is in this chamber between now and 2045. But the headline targets which are in this bill to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and for restoration and regeneration by 2045 are in there, and we need to ensure that we hit those targets. I'm not going to touch too much on environmental assessments, national parks and deer numbers, because I think they've already been addressed somewhat. It's all in the bill and it does play a part in the wider picture. Instead, I'm going to talk about Aberdeen, the future net zero capital of the world, which I will say in every debate I get a chance to. A few folk are probably now wondering how much biodiversity we have in Aberdeen as a city. Apart from the scurries, or as we call them in Aberdeen, or seagulls, which I fear some folk want to see added to the extinct species list. But if we're going to make a case to the world that Aberdeen is the best place for net zero expertise, and that our city is a leader in the fight against climate change, then we need to show that running through the North East. It should show the benefits of tackling the climate and biodiversity crisis. Net zero isn't just about how we generate energy. It's also about warm homes. It's also about clean air. It's also about protecting our natural environment. And I know some folks see Aberdeen as an industrial city, a city of granite, concrete and tarmac. And our city is now changing. We no longer have diesel fumes lingering over Union Street, and we now have wildflowers growing in Union Terrace gardens. There are some changes, but they are changes that you can see and that I hope will encourage others to follow suit. And if enough small changes are made, and that can add and will add up to something pretty big. The biodiversity crisis affects all of us, and we all have to play a part. That includes those of us with the more urban seats. But the best thing we can do just now is to get this bill moving forward. So I'm looking forward to seeing this bill move forward. I'm looking forward to seeing this bill pass and making a difference to improve our nation's biodiversity. I'm looking forward to seeing Scotland play its part in tackling the global challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. And if everywhere and everyone plays their part, we will have a better world. So save the world. Scotland still wants to get on. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We move to the closing speeches. I call first Lorna Slater. Again, generous 6 minutes. Ms. Slater.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was an enormous privilege to be involved in the early drafting of this bill as Minister for Biodiversity, and I am glad to see it finally coming to the Chamber. There is so much potential here. Scotland has the aim to stop nature loss by 2030 and to be on a path to nature recovery in the decades after that. In some areas, we've made a start. The reintroduction of the keystone species beavers, some legislation to reduce herbivore numbers, the Nature Restoration Fund, the MPF4 planning framework that considers biodiversity, and reforms to support farmers to improve soil health and adopt nature-friendly practices. We are now only 5 years away from the point at which the Scottish Government has committed to stewarding Scotland towards a future of nature abundance and diversity instead of decline and extinction. Scotland will become a more wooded country, with bare hills populated by native trees. Scotland can become a country where endangered species can live safely and where extinct animals can be reintroduced. Scotland can become a country where the sea is seen as something more than just a resource to exploit, but a vital and valuable ecosystem in its own right. This bill is our opportunity to set the stage for this change of direction. That starts with setting targets for nature recovery. The Scottish Government has signed up to the UN Convention of Biological Diversity. This is where that 30 by 30 target comes from, to protect 30% of Scotland's Scotland's land, water and seas for nature by 2030. I hope to see this made into Scottish law and supported by parties across the Chamber. But there are other targets in that same UN Convention that Scotland has already signed up to. For example, a commitment to ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial, inland water and marine and coastal ecosystems are under effective restoration in order to enhance biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, ecological integrity and connectivity. Now there's something that would make a difference, given how degraded Scotland is, if 30% of it was under active restoration. Capturing that in statute and putting in place the actions to accomplish it, now that would make a difference. I challenge the Scottish Government on this. The Scottish Government were all happy at COP in Montreal to say they supported this UN Convention. Now, make the legislation to carry out that intention. I'm supportive of this bill's intentions around deer management, but concerned that they don't go far enough. Reducing Scotland's deer population is an urgent matter, and previous interventions have been wildly insufficient. The first measures to reduce deer numbers were taken in the 1950s and utterly failed. Deer numbers have doubled twice since that time. We cannot be serious about recovering Scotland's lost biodiversity until deer numbers are brought low enough to allow nature to recover. Deer constantly nibbling away stop Scots pine, rowan, oak and other beautiful and iconic native trees from growing. With sufficiently low deer numbers, native forests have a chance to recover on their own without the need for expensive fencing and planting. We need to modernise the system of deer management and give NatureScot enhanced powers to intervene when deer are out of control on ecologically sensitive areas. I'm also supportive of the bill's intentions on national parks, as gutted as I am that Galloway will not be benefiting from the estimated £10 million a year that would have come its way with a new national park, as well as all the jobs, tourism and support for local businesses and communities. What a missed opportunity that was. This bill leaves a glaring gap. Scotland's seas. At the time of the last election, political parties across this chamber were signed up to enhance marine protection. Aside from new powers for ministers to weaken environmental impact assessment, our waters and the species that depend on them barely feature. Lines on a map are not enough. And even where the most destructive fishing is banned, enforcement is weak. At Stage 2, the Greens will seek practical improvements, stronger enforcements to protect marine habitats and the fishers who follow the rules, protection for wrasse still taken in spawning season and inside protected areas, and steps towards a transition to a sustainable fishing fleet. And finally, I think this bill is an excellent opportunity to make progress on two concerns that I know are shared by many stakeholders and are close to me personally. The first is the matter of Sitka seeding from commercial plantations into ecologically sensitive areas. For the last 2 summers, my husband and I have volunteered on Tombane Farm, which is the home to a SSSI for damselfly habitat. Now is the moment to declare to the Chamber that I am the species champion for the northern damselfly. My husband and I use hand tools to cut down as many of the invading Sitka as we can. Similar cases to this are occurring all over Scotland, where Sitka seeding from commercial plantations are causing damage to nearby habitat, damage to restored peat, and costing land managers money to address the problem. The people who are profiting from planting Sitka should be paying for this damage, not the landowners who are being harmed by it. The second matter that is something that energises me enormously is that of pheasant releases. It blows my mind that in Scotland you need a licence and 40 pages of paperwork to relocate a single native red squirrel from one part of Scotland to another. But anyone, anywhere, can release any number of tropical birds, as long as they're pheasants. Pheasants may be carrying bird flu. They're probably eating the eggs of native reptiles. They're almost certainly feeding our fox population with its attendant management issues. No consideration is given to the welfare of the birds or the livelihoods of the poultry farmers whose birds may be infected by the diseases that the pheasants are carrying. We don't know who does this, where they're releasing them, or how many. It's extraordinary that the release of these tropical birds into Scotland isn't licensed. Scottish youngsters are unlikely to have ever seen a red kite, a puffin or a sea eagle, but everybody's seen a pheasant, and that's got to change.
Thank you. I now call Mercedes Villalba, again a generous 6 minutes. Ms Villalba.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank all members for taking part in today's debate. As my Labour colleagues Sarah Boyack and Rhoda Grant have already made clear, we will be supporting the bill at Stage 1 today because we recognise the issue at the heart of this bill, which is how we protect Scotland's 90,000 species, 11% of which, as we've heard from Jackie Dunbar, are threatened with extinction. Because Scotland's level of biodiversity intactness is in the lowest 15% of the world. And the Scottish Government has failed to meet its environmental targets. In the last decade alone, 43% of Scotland's species have seen a decline. Biodiversity loss is, of course, a global issue, but I think we would all agree that Scotland has a moral and ecological duty to be a world leader in reversing this decline. But in order for this bill to do that and to meet its goal of reversing biodiversity loss and restoring a healthy, stable ecosystem, it must be amended in several key areas, not least the issues highlighted by Labour and others today with Part 2 of the bill. From what we've heard, if the government doesn't bring forward serious considered amendments to Part 2, there will be proposals to remove this part altogether. So I do hope the Cabinet Secretary takes heed. And while we've heard from Tim Eagle and some of his Conservative colleagues their concerns about whether there is a need for the bill, his citing of previously non-statutory approaches and the failing of those has actually, I think, made quite a strong case for bringing forward the statutory targets and the need for Part 1 of the bill. Particularly important to the debate is how we protect and restore our natural environment and native flora and fauna. These are currently threatened by the devastating impact of invasive non-native species, as highlighted very aptly today by Beatrice Wishart. In its 2025 inquiry into public financial support for tree planting and forestry, the Royal Society of Edinburgh highlighted current Scottish Government policy and practice that does not go far enough in recognising long-standing problems caused by invasive non-native species. For example, as we've just heard, Sitka spruce, which accounts for 43% of Scotland's woodlands, is a major threat as it dries out the peatland ecosystem and outcompetes native species such as, I'm probably going to say this wrong, sphagnum moss. No, I'm not the nature champion. Additionally, when Sitka is planted on peatlands, there's a risk that carbon sequestered by the land can then be released. Yet this ecologically destructive species is currently exempt from the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act. And this exemption isn't based on environmental science, but it's being driven by the profit motive in the commercial forestry industry. Now, if myself or one of my constituents released Japanese knotweed into the wild, even accidentally, that would be illegal. But private companies are effectively allowed to commit widespread acts of ecological vandalism, degrading vast swathes of Scotland's environment without fear of being even so much as fined, all in the name of profit. Now, this demonstrates a need for Scotland to tighten its legislation surrounding the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act and look at reworking exemptions for non-native invasive species. We also need to look at the cost to the public purse of government subsidies for such invasive non-native species, like Sitka spruce, which accounts for 50% of commercial planting in the UK. The destruction of our natural environment in order to line the pockets of shareholders can't be allowed to continue. Instead, Scottish Forestry could require that planting schemes include native planting and regeneration and require these schemes to consider the spread of tree seed from non-native invasive species. Such considerations could include continued monitoring of how the spread can be reduced and, where necessary, seedlings of non-native invasive species should be removed. Providing public subsidies to damaging commercial conifer forests completely contradicts Scotland's biodiversity and environment restoration targets. The Scottish Government should reassess subsidies for coniferous commercial tree planting. Indeed, the ethical and financial responsibility of rectifying harm to the environment should rest on the developers and private companies who are causing that harm, with a polluter pays principle, which was touched on by Lorna Slater. It's not just us on these benches that are saying this. Groups like the Scottish Environment Link and the RSPB agree. Currently, environmental restoration efforts, including by Nature Scot, are using their already overstretched budgets to mitigate the damage to our natural environment caused by negligent private companies. According to RSPB research, the financial cost for removal of conifer seedlings and seed rain in flow country peatlands is already into the millions of pounds. A polluter pays principle would address this directly through the creation of statutory requirements for proper management of invasive non-native species, and successful implementation would create a robust framework for liability for environmental damage. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I want to be clear that Scottish Labour, like others, supports the general principles of this bill. However, if this Parliament is serious about reversing the trend of biodiversity loss, then we must be clear that the current iteration of the bill does need significant amending. That way, Scotland can become a true world leader in combating the nature crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Fialba. And I call Maurice Golden again. Generally 7 minutes. Mr Gold.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In recent months, we have seen an alarming retreat from climate action. That is deeply concerning because the threats posed by climate change and biodiversity loss have not diminished. These twin crises will not pass Scotland by, as Sarah Boyack highlighted. The Cabinet Secretary said that Parliament has a long and proud tradition of supporting our natural environment, and also that this defines our place in the world. True. Yet the reality is we are already one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, with a 15% decline in average species abundance since the mid-90s, according to the State of Nature report. Without action, we face further damage, whether it be the degradation of our iconic landscape, rising flood risks for our communities, or new pressures on businesses. The Natural Environment Bill is an opportunity not just to halt this environmental decline, but to actively restore our natural heritage and reverse biodiversity loss, as Mark Ruskell highlighted. Deputy Presiding Officer, I will focus my comments on Scotland's seas, but as we've heard throughout this debate, this bill touches every corner of Scotland's natural environment. Part 1, biodiversity targets. I think it's clear that statutory biodiversity targets should be ambitious, practical and achievable. Tim Eagle pointed out to serial failures of successive Scottish governments to meet the targets they outlined in their own strategies dating back to 2004. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson pointed out that we have to have an effective and sustainable approach to biodiversity. There was lots of concerns raised around Part 2, partially addressed, I believe, by the Cabinet Secretary, and Sarah Boyack pointed to the sweeping regulatory powers and concerns that standards could in fact be undermined, and there was a requirement to build public trust. Happy to.
Douglas Ross.
I listened to the Cabinet Secretary, I think just before Sarah Boyack intervened earlier on, to outline about the amendments he would be looking to take forward. Does the member not agree that perhaps if the Government had done their work in advance of lodging this bill, they should have seen the potential problems and we wouldn't be looking to amend the bill at stage 2? They'd have got it right at stage 1.
Maurice Golden.
I agree with the member, and there's no reason at this point in the session, almost 2 decades into government, that we don't have the full information at stage 1. In terms of national parks, I firmly believe that Scottish ministers should announce a formal, independent and objective review of our existing national parks before any new national parks are designated, in order that we really properly assess what has been achieved. I think it's also key to define what one is, or at the very least define what one is in the particular geographical area for local communities, to avoid the farce that we saw in Dumfries and Galloway, where there were so many factors to be considered that no one actually knew what the national park meant and whether they could support it or not. And these include biodiversity, tourism, economic development, hospitality, retail and farming. There was no blueprint there, and that meant there was increasing difficulties for the communities in that part of Scotland. In terms of deer management, Tim Eagle pointed out the requirement for clarity and proportionality with respect to the expanded Nature Scotland powers, and Beatrice Wishart said that we must avoid unintended consequences and ensure that any training is proportionate. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, let me now turn to Scotland's seas. The current state of our marine environment demands meaningful action, and the bill is an opportunity to deliver it. So I welcome the Scottish Government's recognition in its policy memorandum of the 30 by 30 target, ensuring that 30% of our land and seas are in areas of protection or conservation by 2030. But aspiration alone is not enough. As drafted, the bill doesn't give us the tools required to turn ambition into reality. Groups like the RSPB Scotland and the Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust have raised similar concerns, and they are right to do so. For one thing, there is no specific biodiversity targets for our marine environment in the bill. Now, that's obviously concerning, but anyone involved in the marine sector will also know there has been a long-running pattern of inaction. We passed the Marine Scotland Act in 2010 to designate marine protected areas. This Act was pioneering as one of the first comprehensive marine management frameworks globally, setting a precedent for integrated marine planning and conservation. But it then took until this year, some 15 years later, to get offshore management measures finalised. And indeed, a full suite of offshore management measures will not be in place by the end of this parliamentary session. So whilst 30% of Scotland's inshore waters may be marked on a map as protected, less than 1% is currently protected from all commercial fishing activity. Let's be honest here. A protected area in name is not protection at all. We were supposed to see an Inshore Fisheries Act in 2016. After multiple consultations, it is still not materialised. Meanwhile, the National Marine Plan is now a decade out of date, which is obviously doing neither the environment nor the fishing industry any favours. Let me be clear, this does not have to be a choice between protecting nature and supporting fishing communities. Too often these priorities have been pitted against one another. They should be mutually reinforcing. In England's inshore waters, we are seeing a different approach, where local communities, fishermen, councils collaborate to strengthen both marine ecosystems and the fishing industries that depend on them. That is the direction Scotland should be going. Yet earlier this year, when my colleague Tim Eagle raised this at committee, the Marine Directorate responded that this was not currently realistic. Deputy Presiding Officer, what is not realistic is believing we continue down the path we are on. If the Scottish Government and this Parliament work together at stages 2 and 3, we can strengthen this bill and begin the shift away from marine decline towards marine recovery. So I urge all members to take that opportunity.
Thank you, Mr Golding. And I now invite Jim Fairley to wind up the debate. Minister, a generous 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'd first of all like to thank colleagues from across the Chamber for their engagement and their contributions in today's debate. And I want to recognise that we realise that there is work to do and we are committed to doing it. As members will know, there are 3 government ministers working on this bill, and I hope that that demonstrates the importance that the government attaches to protecting and restoring our natural environment. Cross-portfolio working is necessary to ensure effective legislation which works for nature and, importantly, one which is developed in partnership with our key stakeholders, with our rural land managers, with our ENGOs, our farmers and our crofters. And I hope that we can build consensus right across this chamber in recognition of the fact that nature is all of our responsibility and our natural environment is for all of us to protect. And I've spent many hours carefully considering what it is that we're actually trying to do with this bill. What are we trying to achieve? The reality is this is a hugely complex subject and it requires careful consideration, working in partnership to ensure that we avoid any unintended consequences. And as a youngster, I lived in a housing estate and I had a loft full of pigeons in the back garden. I had a dog in the house and I had a rabbit hutch in the back as well. I have always been immersed in nature and living things for as long as I can remember. I remember the days in the garden after the old bird racing season was over in June and before the young bird season began later on. I'd be sitting in the sun, watching my birds in the silence, taking in the hum and the buzz of nature all around me. There was the high-pitched darting of the hoverflies. There was the lazy drone of bumblebees. There was the industrious buzz of honeybees. There was the incessant annoyance of flies and blue bottles. There were greenfinches, sparrows, blackbirds and the starlings all coming in to mooch around the garden for a bit of raking the seed that I would leave out for my pigeons. There were swallows and house martins and swifts screeching overhead, and the blue tits were flitting around, feeding their chicks in the nest box that I had pegged in the outside of my pigeon loft. There was an abundance of grass and flowers and gardens with clover, and there were so many honeybees buzzing around, gathering pollen. And all of that was in a 10 by 15 metre square of grass in a housing estate back garden. It was a microcosm of a nature sanctuary in Letham, where I was brought up, and it was great to grow up with it. But as I reminisced, I was asking myself the question, would that same garden today, would that 150 metre square grass be able to hold such an abundance of life now? And abundance is the word that springs to mind. How many gardens have got that abundance now? Now, I've been absolutely blessed in my life to have spent so much of it living and working with nature. The rhythm of so much of my life has been at one sync with the ebb and flow of seasons when I was a farmer. I've had immense joy living in places where curlews and peewees and oyster catchers and snipe were my alarm call, where the hum and the buzz of nature was my backdrop, and when I grabbed a catnap in the fields, where my office was a tapestry of beauty, I'll come back to you, with the likes which is the envy of the world. And I hope that everyone in this chamber agrees that what we want to do is ensure that we can pass that and so much more on to the next generation and the next generation after that. So I'll take your intervention.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate the Minister giving way. Whilst it's very nice to have had the first 3.5 minutes of your debate contribution focused on the Minister's taken 3.5 minutes of his debate time to set out his involvement in the natural environment. However, there are some sort of serious issues that have been raised as part of stage 1, including concerns around part 2 of the bill. If the Government has engaged with stakeholders, why have we got a stage part 2 that's going to need significant amendments or removed to keep stakeholders happy? We did not hear one voice that supported part 2 of the bill.
Minister, I can give you the time back.
So I think my initial response to that is, whatever I say in this chamber is my choice. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the member trying to criticise or tell me what I should or shouldn't be saying. But what I am going to say is that climate change is a reality. More extreme weather events, seasons and temperature species are all impacted by climate change. And it's for that reason that there is an imperative on all of us to work together, to be cohesive, to build consensus. We may not agree about the details of the journey we are on, because we are undoubtedly on that journey together. But I am pleased in the way that some members have actually approached this bill today so that we can actually get that kind of consensus. Our politics are I certainly will.
Sarah Boyack.
So, given the raft of comments that came up from third sector organisations, experts and the committee, it would be really useful for the Chamber to hear what actual changes the Government is committed to making at stage 2, in addition to what the Cabinet Secretary said, and also getting us copies of that as soon as possible so it's proper parliamentary scrutiny.
Minister.
Well, okay, I will take the point on board. We've listened carefully to what the members have said. We've listened carefully to what stakeholders said. The Cabinet Secretary has already agreed to meet with members in order to take those issues forward. So I hope that that gives you the confidence that we're actually trying to engage with the members. Because, as I've said, there's an imperative on all of us to make this bill work. Our politics are polarised right now, and this bill represents a test as to whether or not we can find a consensus to ensure that our nation thrives with nature at its heart. The Government is committed to working in partnership with our key stakeholders to ensure that the bill ensures that our key stakeholders have the tools and the support that they need to protect and restore nature, in a way which works for our rural land managers and communities, one which builds on their stewardship and recognises their role as custodians of our iconic landscapes and species. To do nothing is not an option. This challenge is one which we must take affirmative action on. We've got to secure our natural environment, and I urge members to support the bill. Now, we've already had an ambitious biodiversity strategy and delivery plan with over 100 actions underway. Now, these include £250 million for peatland restoration. Over 10 years, that's helping to lock in carbon and restore vital habitats. That restoration is increasingly being integrated with established land management practices, supporting organisations like Scottish Water and helping create safer, more productive landscapes for livestock, which in turn strengthens farm businesses. Woodland creation grants are supporting landowners to expand native forests and improve biodiversity for integrating trees into working farm practices. The pilot deer management incentive scheme in central Scotland and South Loch Ness are helping to reduce grazing pressure and to support habitat recovery. The Better Biodiversity Data Project is strengthening our natural monitoring infrastructure and support evidence-led decision-making. Support for wild venison processing, including grants for chillers and larders, helping communities benefit from sustainable deer management. Deer management should not be seen as the removal of a pest species, but rather a harnessing of a resource which is iconic to Scotland and has got multiple health, environmental and economic value benefits to Scotland plc. As I close this debate, Presiding Officer, I want to stress again the Government cannot solve this nature crisis alone. We need collective action. We should all recognise the vital role of our land managers, our farmers, our foresters and our landowners across Scotland. Many are already doing fantastic work, and while still producing food, they restore habitats, they reduce emissions and they are supporting biodiversity. From integrating peatland restoration into farm operations to managing deer sustainably, their leadership is making a real difference on the ground. And I believe with the continuation of that positive dialogue, we can help them to go further and faster, and with the confidence that this SNP government is behind them. Should members agree to support the general principles of the bill today, and I think they should, we will work with you and the stakeholders and with communities to deliver a landmark natural environment bill. A bill that builds on the vision set out in our biodiversity strategy, and a bill that gives us the tools to act, the targets to aim for and the accountability to stay on course. And a bill that says clearly we are not going to stand by while nature declines. We will act together to restore it, and I think we should make that commitment today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 1. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. Point of order, Edward Mountain.
Presiding Officer, can I apologise to you and the Chamber, and especially to Mr Felly, for interrupting him with my telephone. It was accidental. I thought I'd turned it off. I turned it off on my hearing aids, but not on my telephone. But I feel embarrassed enough to apologise, and I hope you'll accept it.
Thank you. Not a point of order, but thank you for putting that on the record, Mr Mountain.